You are a machine built for one purpose: to make a human. No, not like that. In some ways, you might even say your purpose is to become your own clone. What do I mean? You are a fascinating machine, one that defies chance and probability. And when we turn our gaze inward, we can learn some fascinating and inspiring things about our Creator. Today on Biblically Speaking, we'll examine the God Code and see what there is to learn by looking at what He has put within each of us. Welcome, my friends. I'm your host, Jared Bowman, and this is Biblically Speaking, your program to learn about the Word of God. We talk about difficult passages. We look at evidence for God. We look at things outside of Scripture and ask, do they point us to or away from God? And right now is a great time to point this out. You can hit that like button, the subscribe, the share, and you will never miss an update to this program. Now, this episode's a little long in coming. It's taken me a while to put all of this together because, you see, I'm a guy that likes to look up into the sky. But for this episode, as I said in the introduction, we have to look somewhere totally different. We're looking inwardly, and we want to look at the mechanics of the cell, our DNA. Is there anything in that code that points us to our Creator? Now, I want to start by reading part of one of the Psalms, and it's going to be germane to the things that we're going to talk about. So be opening to the 139th Psalm, and let's read what David says here. For you formed me, verse 13, my inward parts. You wove me in my mother's womb, and I will give thanks to you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works, and my soul knows it very well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was made in secret and skillfully wrought in the depths of the earth. It's interesting, David is hearkening back to some of those things in creation when man was created and God formed Adam out of the dirt, and he's translating how God formed Adam to basically, I'm still dirt. I'm still made from dirt, is David's conclusion. Your eyes have seen my unformed substance, and in your book were all written the days that were ordained for me, when as yet there was not one of them. So what David is saying is that God knows him in a way that only his Creator can know him. And the question that we should look at today is that still true? Are there things about us, about how we're made, about how our cells replicate, and the DNA that we require in order to be living things? Is there anything in that that points to God? As said in the introduction, you are a machine, and you're built for the purpose of making a human. The information to make you is encoded in a set of instructions received from your parents in the form of chromosomes. Chromosomes are structures containing genes, and each gene has a specific place in one of the 23 pairs of chromosomes that are passed from biological parent to child. Now, the genes themselves are made up of DNA. The DNA is the code that makes you, you. It contains all the information for your height, the color of your hair, your eye color, whether or not you'll go bald. All of those things are written in the code. And your body, at different times, will replicate different segments of that code. Using that information, it builds proteins. And those proteins become the stuff of which we are made. Now, as we just mentioned, the DNA that you have, that code, is the instruction for making more of you. In fact, that's its number one job, is to make more of you. But how does it do it? How do strings of nucleotide bases become proteins that become the building block for muscle and hair and bone and all that we are? Well, you see, I kind of oversimplified it because it's not just about making more of who we are. Our DNA has to store, interpret, and replicate itself in a reliable way so that we can grow from infancy into adulthood and keep our bodies alive even past that. And for those three functions to take place, it begins, believe it or not, by breaking down the DNA into individual strands. Now, DNA is what you call a double helix structure. We've all seen artist renderings of the classic double helix DNA, the nucleotide pairs that are bound to the ribbon-like sugar phosphate backbone that holds the whole thing together like strings of Christmas lights. But what you may not know is that there's a strict pairing order across that backbone. Adenine can only pair with thymine, and guanine can only pair with cytosine. You can't combine them in any other way. And so, based on those rules, we understand that the DNA is formed according to a very strict regiment of how it can be built. Why is this important? Well, it's important because the process of creating it begins with tearing those bases apart, separating them at their bonds. Your body from the cell creates RNA and begins to combine the missing pairs with new copies of those pairs, and thereby creates two strands of that particular section of DNA code. Now, this is amazing because all of this has to be able to happen for life to continue. You can't just have RNA. You can't just have DNA. You have to have the ability for DNA to be separated based on the instructions that it's finding within the cell and divide at the proper times and in the proper places to create the kinds of cells that your body needs. Is only when those nucleotides are understood, read, and transcribed that your body can then take them and begin to build amino acids, and from those amino acids, proteins, and from those proteins, the organs and the tissue that you need. I know what you're thinking. Well, that's simple enough. And if you are thinking that, well, we're not quite done with the story. Because you see, DNA and information is not enough to do this. The DNA needs the help of a certain kind of protein called histone. In fact, it sort of wraps itself around histone. And histone used to be thought of as kind of a suitcase for DNA. But what we really see is that histone is responsible for gene expression, and it helps DNA express itself at the proper time. Because you see, within your DNA, one of the things that isn't often talked about is there are multiple copies of the code that your body can use during different types of events, like puberty. Remember when your voice dropped and other bodily changes started happening? Why weren't those going on before? Well, a different copy of your code came into play because your body judged that it was the right time for those things to happen. Are you starting to get the complexity here? Because you see, the problem is, if DNA produces the amino acids that produce the protein, but DNA needs the protein in order to do its job, which came first? We've already talked in other episodes about the likelihood of generating a random protein being beyond unfathomable. But how about a random string of DNA? How about a new protein out of just these building blocks? Something functional. Let's say for a moment that the prebiotic soup really could produce deoxyribonucleic acid or RNA, and somehow strands of RNA come together and combine in just the right way to form DNA. That's still not the whole process. Because you see, to get a single strand of DNA that makes any sense, that can be combined together to form a gene, and that gene teaches us how to express a protein, you already have to, as has been said, have a protein, histone, to begin with. But in order for these things to work, you have to first acknowledge that they are extremely rare events. Now, I want to introduce you to a couple of different books. This one is by a man by the name of Bo Kirkwood. It's called The Evolution Delusion. Try to get that in focus for you. The other three you're probably more familiar with if you watch this program. One is Stephen Meyer's The Return of the God Hypothesis, and the other is Stephen Meyer's Darwin's Doubt, and I would include in that also his Signature in the Cell. And I would encourage you to pick up all four of these books, that there are links in the description. Now, one of the things that Meyer talks about in all three of his books, and Kirkwood talks about in his book, The Evolution Delusion, is that the rarity of these things put them beyond the realm of chance, especially when there is an easier and much more likely explanation. Now, I say likely, and I know some of you are going to balk at that, but you need to realize it's not just men like Stephen Meyer and Bo Kirkwood that say this. But as I mentioned in the previous episode, there are a number of even Nobel laureates that are looking at DNA. You'll remember even men, the PhDs like David Gelernter at Yale, talked about how the code of DNA points to some sort of intelligent design. Even Richard Dawkins has mentioned on more than one occasion that DNA is very computer code-like and that there is some sort of intelligent design. Now, his idea of intelligent design is alien life, or called panspermia. When you stop and consider the complexity of the genetic code, that one gene might have several thousand bases, and even a small protein has a few hundred different amino acids that make up its composition, time and chance aren't really a good explanation for it. But neither is some alien life form. Now, the sad delusion to all of this is that they would rather answer the question with another question than give the answer that makes sense. And this is especially true when you stop and consider how rare it is for even DNA after it's formed to express a functioning protein or be combined into even a gene, much less a protein fold, that you begin to realize that the rarity exceeds what we can even grasp. Stephen Meyer, in his Return of the God Hypothesis books, talks about a man named Douglas Axe, I believe he's out of Berkeley, California, who worked out in the early 2000s the golden ratio. How many different combinations would you have to try to get one functioning gene or protein fold? And the number he came up with is 10 to the 77th. Understand that, kind of put that in perspective. Imagine a bicycle lock with 77 digits, each one having a possibility of 0 to 9, and there being only one combination for that lock. And the simple fact of the matter is, even if the Earth is twice as old as they believe that it is, there hasn't been enough time to come up with a functioning gene, much less a protein fold. And therein lies the problem. But we're not done. What makes an animal? Why are we different from other species? The Bible uses the word kind to represent families of animals that were capable of producing one another. But what really separates man from other animals? Could changing a few letters in the genetic code turn a mammal into an amphibian? Or allow us to have wings? Do small changes over time explain the differences between horses and dogs, or birds and cats, or man and monkey? Now, in that first section, we talked about the issue with going from molecules to man and how the complexity of DNA and just the fact that it is its own source of information, if there is not a creator or a designer, is inherently problematic. But let's assume for a moment that we can take that off the table and we can just talk about the code itself. Now, all animals on Earth use the same 4 basic nucleotides in their DNA. And they are, for reference, adenine, thymine, guanine, and cytosine. Those 4 nucleotide bases make up every carbon-based life form. We are replicating those 4 bases to form the amino acids that make the proteins. But here's the thing. Can I turn a warm-blooded creature back into something cold-blooded just by moving those base pairs into different positions? And the answer is no. See, information itself is not the whole story. Because you see, I can hand a keyboard to a 2-year-old and I can allow them to hit whatever keys they want to, and information will appear on the screen. but it won't be intelligible. That's the problem with the random and chance DNA. In order for there to be real information that's usable, I need to hand it to someone who knows how to speak a language and understands the significance of those characters. And then perhaps they can write the next great novel. Who knows? Now, you'll remember this from last week. We talked about William Dembski. He's the one who talked about how intelligibility and contingency were two of the attributes that we assign to the proof of intelligence. So the fact that these chemicals combine to make anything, when it's so rare for them to do any of that, is proof that there has to be someone who understands the code. But not only that, he was able to manipulate the code in such a way that it only produces what it always produces. You say, well, that's not true, because what about evolution? Let's talk about that. Darwin believed that if small changes over time couldn't explain the transition between species, and then there's not a uniform tree of life to be found, and his whole theory fell apart. And really, neo-Darwinism, even though it includes things like genetics and DNA, doesn't really separate itself from that. If small changes over time cannot explain why horses and dogs and cats evolved along separate lines from the same initial stock, then we have an issue. And so the question is, what makes an animal? You see, small changes in our DNA, if I could manipulate the DNA code, I might be able to change things like eye color, or hair color, or the height that someone would achieve, or the propensity maybe for going deaf. But when I begin to look at the complexity of what it takes to transition one species to another, I need more than just changes to the code. I need to change the proteins that are made, because see, I have to create whole new systems, whole new muscle structures. I have to change the way the eye works and the way the ears work and everything about the creature. And while there is some homology there, you've seen the pictures before of the man's hand and the bat wing and the dolphin's flipper and the similarity in bone structure. And people point to that and say there's evidence of evolution. And really, that's evidence of design. If it worked in one place, why wouldn't God use it in another place? But simply put, in order to change from one species to another, I can't do it a piece at a time, because it's more than just genetic code. You see, just changing genetic information is not enough. I actually have to take the messenger RNA and teach it how to build new protein folds, which are kind of the matrices for how amino acids can be stacked into proteins, and proteins can form cells, and cells can form tissue. I actually have to teach the messenger RNA to do that in order to form any new system. And until that, I'm just introducing new code into the DNA strand that's not doing anything at best, and at worst is harmful. And this is why we don't see those transitional species that Darwin said that we should. And do you know, there's not been an example of a transitional species. That goes back to one of the original questions that I asked in the video about the 3 questions that atheists can answer. Where are the transitional species? Where is the monkey to man? Where is the pre-dog to dog? Where is the link between lions and dogs? It's not there. And it's not there because creating one species from another is impossible unless someone is able to not only recode the DNA, but the whole cell. And when you get right down to it, what this really means, and we've all seen this in movies, just changing the DNA or inserting the amphibian DNA into the reptile DNA to repair the code doesn't work. And it doesn't work because the instructions aren't there. Because you see, the code to write the individual is not really in the DNA. It's in the epigenetics. The things that are outside of the DNA that help the DNA do its job. That means that major changes occurring be gradual, because there's no expression for them, as Kirkwood talks about. There's no expression for them until the body learns how to express the information in the DNA in the form of a protein fold. And until that happens, you don't gain any function, which means there is no survival of the fittest. It's at best a mutation that would render that animal sterile or at least susceptible to other problems because there's no healthy way of expressing the change to its genetic code. So sorry, you're not getting wings anytime soon. So that means to evolve from a cold-blooded animal to a warm-blooded animal, and to reverse that process is more than just changing the nucleotide bases. It means I have to change everything about the creature. It has to happen all at once. And Darwin himself said that would be the death of his theory. Perhaps one of the most significant evidences for God outside of your DNA is the irreducible complexity of the body. The human vision requires nearly 20 separate chemical reactions, molecules forming, unforming, and reforming, in order to translate light through your optic nerve to your brain and return your eye to a stasis that it can see the next image. This is all happening in picoseconds. And yet, each one of these sets of instructions, had it evolved on its own, would have meant blindness for the creature. Clotting is even more impressive. Have you ever cut your finger? There are roughly 22 separate chemical processes that have to take place. If they don't happen, then even a small cut would mean that we bleed to death. And if they aren't regulated at the edge of the cut, then your entire circulatory system would become one giant clot. Talk about a heart attack. You see, these are two examples of systems that could not have evolved slowly over time. The molecular chemistry, separate and apart from the structures themselves, had to have come into being all at once, or else not only do they serve no function, they would have killed the host. In many ways, you are the most complex machine that's ever been created. So I guess you could say at the end of the day is we're a little like Rube Goldberg devices. You know those crazy things that fry an egg based on dominoes, bowling balls, and pendulums moving? We've all seen those. We've laughed at sort of the absurdity and the complexity. But one of the things you have to appreciate when you get to the end of that particular demonstration is that there was an irreducible complexity. Each piece had to have touched the one before. Bo Kirkwood uses the example in his book, The Evolution Delusion, of the mousetrap. The mousetrap, like the human eye, seems relatively simple. I mean, you have the pupil and the iris, the retina and the sclera, and it seems relatively simple, especially since the connection between the eye and the brain is the optic nerve. Nothing that we wouldn't understand. But when you take into account the fact that there's 22 or so separate chemical reactions that have to take place in order for you to see, the machine becomes much more complex. That's irreducible complexity. And as Darwin said, if the transitional forms don't exist and micro changes can't explain the transition from one species to another, then the whole theory falls. Then what we've just seen is that the whole theory falls apart. Because you are more than just information. You are more than just amino acids and proteins. You are built for the purpose of being you. And I've got to tell you, I like that a lot better than the cold, unfeeling indifference that Dawkins spoke of. You see, we're all, at the end of the day, really just Rube Goldberg devices. We are information, chemistry, protein built from amino acids. But is that all we are? The answer is a resounding no. You see, you are the most complex machine that God ever created. The Bible says that you and I are more than just the sum of our parts. We're actually made in the image of God. Darwin believed that his theory lived and died based on whether or not small changes were the expression of larger mutations. When even large mutations in the code cannot explain the difference in species, then we need to look elsewhere. Evidence of DNA gives us much more reason than ever to look beyond materialism and see a creator. So that's our show. Thank you so much for being here. And at the end of it, I'm reminded of the words of Ecclesiastes chapter 11. Just as you do not know the path of the wind and how the bones are formed in the womb of the pregnant woman, so you do not know the activity of God who makes everything. Because that's the conclusion we ultimately come to, is that without God, none of this really makes any sense. I know some of you will likely disagree with that. Feel free to do that in the comments. Please be respectful of others. I've had that issue before. Also, now's a great time to like, subscribe, and share. And I want to remind you of this. I promised you an announcement at the beginning, and here it is. We are starting a second episode of Biblically Speaking every week. It's going to take the place of the old Walk Through the Word that was discontinued a few months ago. We're going to continue this series on evidences. A lot of you have told me you've enjoyed it, would like to see a little bit more on that, and I was ready to fold it up, but apparently we're going to do more. And I'm going to be getting some special guests in to help me with both of those projects. I'm looking at one guest in particular for another episode on DNA, because we kind of reached my intellectual capacity for DNA without doing a whole lot more studying than what I've done over the past 6 weeks or so preparing for this episode. I've got a couple of different people that I'm looking at getting onto the show, and I can't wait to tell you about them. Until next time, I'm going to put a video over here about beholding the mind of God, what scientists have said about God, because science is actually not against God, as you may have heard. And we're going to put the video over here about the questions that atheists have some trouble answering, and I'll wait for your responses to that. It's been interesting so far. But as always, thank you for taking the time to join me on this journey that we've taken. And as always, until I see you again, have a good day, and God bless.